Well, hello again, Spring Lake Village, and thank you for joining me once again as we explore the world of the monks of the Middle Ages, in particular Irish monks, and the role they played in preserving the written word and the art of winemaking. This week's lecture is entitled Irish Monks Abroad, Scholarship at the Courts of Europe. Well, in our last lecture, we discussed the rise of the Irish monastic movement, which began in the middle of the 6th century AD, and the explosion in monasteries, the number of monasteries that were established. By 625, we are told by an Irish chronicler that the number of monasteries in their schools had multiplied exceedingly. By 625, there were approximately 80 monastic centers, and these centers would have included not only the abbey, but a school and workplaces, uh, areas dedicated to farming, etc. So they were communities, and most of these communities consisted of somewhere around maybe 300 to 500 monks, and then perhaps as many as 2,000 lay people. So this monastic movement was extraordinarily successful. First, in spreading the Christian message, not only in Ireland, but eventually in Northern England, in Scotland, in Wales, and then, as we'll discuss today, to the continent of Europe. Now, the towering figure of the age, as we discussed last week, was the Irish monk Saint Columcille. That's his Irish Gaelic name, but he is perhaps best remembered as Columba. That's his Latin equivalent. It was Saint Columba who really spearheaded this monastic movement and the establishment of what were at the time the largest monastic centers in the whole of Christendom. From his famous monastery of Iona, which is located off the coast of Mull in Scotland, a monastery he founded in 563, Columba educated a whole new generation of Catholic missionaries to spread the Christian message and expand literacy. So many of his students would make their way to Northeast England, an area called Northumberland or Northumbria, Wales, and various areas of Britain. And they would inaugurate what was known as the Anglo-Irish Renaissance. The Anglo-Irish Renaissance was characterized by an explosion in literacy and education, and the compilation of classical libraries, wherein many ancient manuscripts were collected and copied. Among the great centers of transcription and the copying of Greek and Roman texts were Bangor, founded around 558, located in Northern Ireland, and perhaps the most famous of all, a monastery community located off the northeast coast of England. This is the famous monastery of Lindisfarne, which was established by the famous Irish monk Aidan around 634 AD. So, in addition to the role St. Columba played in the establishment of this remarkable Irish monastic movement, St. Columba is also remembered for his advancement in the creation of a vernacular Latin. In other words, a demotic Latin, a Latin that could be understood and read by everyday native people. And he was singularly committed to recruiting poets and bards and giving them training in the arranging of the very important annals of monasteries, especially devoted to Latin poetry and the compilation of old Gaelic epics that could be read through this new vernacular Latin. Over time, the monastic libraries were really the only repositories of books to be found anywhere in Europe, in particular in Ireland, in Scotland, in Britain. Not as many books at this time were extant in continental Europe. So one chronicler made the remark that books were much more numerous in Ireland than anywhere else in the world at the time. So in addition to Columba, there were also Irish monks who were now trained in the vernacular alphabets and in the teaching of Latin. As I mentioned last week, the Irish were very influential in the development of a kind of Latin that could be understood by the masses. And they created vernacular alphabets that were based upon Latin and Greek letters that would allow them to be able to write Irish Gaelic, which at the time did not really have an understandable alphabet. I mean, you had this old runic alphabet called Agam that could only be read by a few, but now you have a new vernacular alphabet, again, based upon Latin and Greek alphabet that could now be used for deciphering Irish Gaelic, in particular. When you learn inflected languages like Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit, these languages have case endings and different inflections that have to be understood. So this is a very important uh, advancement, a very important uh, development that took place as a result of this work on the part of Columba and his new generation of monks in the development of the Latin language. And also, of course, were the establishment within the monasteries of scriptoria, literally places of writing. So these were the rooms or cells, as they were called, that were located in monastic establishments where texts were copied and transcribed, and where glorious illuminated manuscripts were created. So a scriptorium, of course, the singular of scriptoria, the scriptorium was a long room that was lit only by the light from the windows with wooden chairs and writing tables. So contrary to maybe sort of this popular view that these cells were often lit by candles, that was not the case, because there was always worry that fire might destroy some of the manuscripts. But as you see in this illustration here, this beautiful illuminated engraving, you can see a monk sitting at a high desk. There are numerous paint wells with various paints that the monk himself would have created, and the monks were very much part of the whole illuminated manuscript process from start to finish. So they would actually create the vellum parchment from cow skins. They would create these natural paints. They would take plants and dyes and actually create these natural paints, and then work laboriously for hours on end, creating these beautiful illuminated manuscripts. So the period between 500 to 800 AD is regarded as the golden age of illuminated manuscripts. Some of the most dazzling manuscripts ever created are from this period of 300 years. And one of the most important developments in the creation of a new written iconography and a written language was the development of what was called semi-uncial letters. So if you look at manuscripts that were created on the continent of Europe, so in Gaul, modern day France, or in particular in Italy, normally monks use uppercase Roman letters, the uncial, the uppercase lettering. But the semi-uncial was much more fluid, allowed you to have greater freedom in creating very elegant cursive writing, a very beautiful calligraphy. And these magnificent illuminated manuscripts with semi-uncial writing were produced in the great monastic centers of Ireland and Scotland in particular. We have the Lindisfarne Gospels from the famous monastery of Lindisfarne off the coast of England, but the most famous, the most celebrated, of course, is the Book of Kells, one of the most lavish and most beautiful illuminated manuscripts ever created, famous for its glorious cursive Irish semi-uncial writing. So the Book of Kells is sometimes known as the Book of Columba. Again, it's celebrated for the intricacy, the glorious individual illuminations that are so dazzling and so rich, and show this level of connoisseurship that was simply unknown at this time. The dazzling colors, the beautiful calligraphy, etc. So the Book of Kells contains the four Gospels of the New Testament, but the Gospel of St. John was left unfinished. And there are also prefatory texts and tables written in Latin. Today, the Book of Kells is housed in the famed library of Trinity College in the city of Dublin, Ireland. Most scholars date the book to around 800, although it may be somewhat earlier. The name of the book itself is derived from the famous Abbey of Kells, which is located in County Meath, Ireland, where a number of monks fled after the Viking raid on St. Columba's monastery of Iona in 806. Now, there has been an ongoing debate, one which goes on even today, regarding the date itself of the Book of Kells and where it was actually created. To date, there are some 5 theories that have been proposed concerning the origin and the time of completion of the manuscript. So one school maintains that it was entirely created in Iona and then brought to Kells, again, this as a result of the Viking raid that took place on the Abbey of Iona in 806. Or perhaps it was begun at Iona and then work was continued at Kells Abbey but never complete. Perhaps it was entirely the product of the Abbey of Kells, or it was produced at Lindisfarne. And from the books I've read over the years, I believe this theory is the most provides the most evidence, I believe, because Lindisfarne had already had a long tradition of creation of illuminated manuscripts, like the Lindisfarne Gospels, noted for their magnificent calligraphy. So perhaps it was produced, in fact, at Lindisfarne, and then perhaps taken to Iona after a raid at the monastery at Lindisfarne, and then taken to Iona, and then in turn safeguarded after the Viking raids in 806. Or there are some who believe it's the product of an unknown monastery in Scotland. Because of its lavishness, the Book of Kells is thought by many to have been the manuscript on the high altar, which would have been used during masses on the island of Iona. The brightly colored illustrations and illuminations would have made it an exceptionally impressive piece to a congregation. Now, as I mentioned, the Gospel of St. John is incomplete. There is some evidence that the outside cover was stolen. In fact, there's actual evidence to support the fact that the beautiful jewel-encrusted case was stolen during a Viking raid. And at the time, perhaps some of the final pages of the manuscript, in particular the Gospel of St. John, were torn off or lost forever. In any case, the Book of Kells remains the most magnificent of all illuminated manuscripts. Now, at the end of the 8th century, the entire region around Ireland, Scotland, and Britain were upended by the arrival of the Vikings. And we see already at the end of the 8th century, Vikings, Norse Vikings in particular, marauding the coast of Ireland, and later Danish Vikings would begin the plunder of Britain. So many of the great monasteries were upended. The monasteries were known for their great wealth and their great libraries and relics. And so these enticed, of course, the Vikings, who saw them as the greatest sources for plunder. So we even have historical records of these marauding expeditions. For example, the Anglo-Saxon chronicles preserve the attack of the famed church of St. Cuthbert on the island of Lindisfarne, which took place in 793. Irish chronicles preserve a narrative of the repeated attacks of the Abbey of Iona off the west coast of Scotland, the first of which took place in 795, 802, and the famous one of 806, and then 825. During the 806 attack, we are told that 68 monks were massacred off of Martyrs Bay. And thereafter, as I mentioned, the remaining community of monks fled Iona, many relocating to the monastic community of Kells in Ireland. And as I mentioned, they may have brought the Book of Kells, which may originally have been produced in Lindisfarne. Now, beneath a church on the island of St. Ninian, which is located in the Shetland Island group, a great hoard of monastic vessels and manuscripts were discovered, suggesting that a Viking raid was imminent, and no doubt the monks of the monastery of St. Ninian hid their most valuable property beneath the church. So this is a world completely upended, causing major social, religious, and economic upheaval and a relocation of the populace. So as the Vikings continued their raids, which would continue into the 9th, 10th, and even early 11th century, we find many of these monastic communities scattering. And many of them then would flee to the continent of Europe. So the Irish missionary movement would be kept alive by so-called Peregrini, as they were called, who fled to the continent of Europe. Many were fleeing, of course, the Viking raids, but many were part of St. Columba's desire to evangelize and establish monasteries and to expand literacy and to train new generation of clerics and also the children of the upper classes. I forgot to mention that at many of the monastic institutions, many of the schools, boys were educated beginning from the age of 5 or 7. They were educated in Latin, the reading of Latin, as well as Greek. And many of them, by the age of 12, could read Virgil, they could read Homer, they could read Tertullian, they could read Horace, etc. And there's also evidence that the firstborn daughters of the upper classes were also educated in the reading and writing of Greek and Latin. So we find these Peregrini making their way to the continent, and in effect, they were returning to the Latin West that had collapsed in the wake of the barbarian invasions of the 5th century AD. They were returning literacy to the continent that had entered into the so-called cultural stagnation period, often called the Dark Ages. And the Irish monastic movement was enormously successful on the continent of Europe, spreading not only the Christian message, but establishing many famous monasteries and some of the most famous schools in all of Europe. So already some 113 monasteries and schools would be established in Gaul or the Kingdom of the Franks or France, as well as Switzerland, some 26 in Germany, 10 in Austria, and 3 in northern Italy. Now, notice in the lower left-hand corner, this fresco of a saint. This is Saint Columbanus, not Columba that I mentioned earlier, Saint Columcille. People often get these two saints mixed up, but this is Saint Columbanus, who is the most famous of the Irish Peregrini, who would go on to establish many famous monasteries in Europe. And he had already established one of the greatest monasteries in all of Ireland. This was the monastery at Bangor in Northern Ireland. So we're not quite sure, but somewhere around the last quarter of the 6th century, Columbanus and 12 disciples, interesting, like the 12 apostles, he had 12 disciples who left Bangor and then made their way to Gaul, in particular the province of Brittany, where he began to spread the Christian message. And he established a school in Burgundy, the famous monastery of Luxeuil, which would go on to become one of the greatest centers of learning throughout the medieval period. And it was at his monastery at Luxeuil, it's a hard French word to pronounce, that he invited many of the greatest scholars of Gaul to come and teach at his famed monasteries, not only courses in theology, not only classes that taught Latin and Greek, of course, but also secular subjects such as astronomy and various areas of the sciences that were emerging as a result of the translation of Greco-Roman texts. So the works of Aristotle, the great 4th century BC Greek philosopher who was so preoccupied with every aspect of human endeavor, from oceanography to biology to astronomy, etc., and the works of Plato. So it's interesting to note that before the arrival of the Irish and the new generation of monks, Irish monks, trained by Saint Columbanus, who began what was called the Columban movement, there were very few European clerics that even had the ability to write in their native French or German or Portuguese or Italian. So this Columban movement really brought about a great shift, a paradigm shift in education and scholarship. One of the greatest achievements of the Middle Ages as a result of these Irish scholars, these Peregrini overseas. So within about 20 years after the arrival of Saint Columbanus. So let's say around AD 600, we see the establishment of many Saint Columbanus missions. So no less than 30 missions were established by the monks of Luxeuil, and another 200 that had sort of an indirect association with his famous monastery. So we know that more than 60 or so students trained by Saint Columbanus and his school at Luxeuil would then make their way across Europe, establishing some of the greatest centers of scholarship to be found anywhere in Europe, including three famous monasteries in the region of Lombardia, that's where we'll find Milan, whose ruler Agilulfo converted to Christianity. In fact, Columbanus converted this famous ruler to Christianity, and it was Agilulfo who actually would give Columbanus the famous monastery of Bobbio, which is located just outside of Piacenza in the Emilia-Romagna region. Bobbio became one of the great centers of scholarship, and it had one of the greatest repository of manuscripts, second only to the Vatican. So within its famous library, one could find not only famous tracts by Augustine, Origen, Tertullian, so theological treatises, but also the pagan works of Homer, of Horace, of Virgil, of Tacitus, etc. And it had a famous scriptorium where many of these great Greco-Roman manuscripts were copied, and where Latin and Greek were taught to a new generation of theologians and the scion of the nobility. And there were also great intellectual centers at, for example, Reims, where the kings of France were coronated. So one of the most brilliant theologians and philosophers of the day, John Scott Uragena. Now, you might think he was from Scotland. In fact, he was from Ireland, as his Latin sobriquet Uragena would imply, although a lot of the Irish at the time were called Scots, so it's a little bit confusing. And many of the Irish Latin scholars, or the Hiberno Latin scholars, the successors of Saint Columbanus, would establish other famous monastery communities. Again, that would include not only the monastery proper or the abbey, but workshops. A lot of them were agricultural communities, because many of these monks not only were at the forefront of scholarship and education, but also advances in agriculture, in irrigation, medicine, etc. But many of the great monasteries of Europe were founded in just outside of Florence, in Fiesole, in Rome, in Lucca, in German-speaking regions, so Regensburg, Trier, Salzburg, and Vienna. And again, Saint Benedict, who established the most important monastic movement on the continent, dictated that a school and a scriptorium had to be part of the monastic community. So this, of course, helped once again in the preservation of the written word and the explosion of education on the continent. I was trying to find a good map on the internet. It was sort of difficult. I know this is very hard to read, but here you can see the blue arrow showing the mission of the Peregrini from Ireland to the continent, especially first to Gaul. As I mentioned, the missionary work of Columbanus and his Irish Peregrini. So these are all the various missionaries that were established on the continent of Europe. And oh, this one actually, yeah, this one here is the missionary work of Columbanus, actually the purple one, not so much the blue one. But again, you can see all of these are the famous monastic communities that were established by the Columban movement. So many of these Irish monks and scholars made their way to the great courts of Europe. Many of the courts that were established in the generations following the collapse of the Roman Empire. So as I mentioned in earlier lectures, many of the kings of the barbarians, the Lombardians, the Ostrogoths, Visigoths, many of those rulers converted to Christianity and established new kingdoms that were built upon the former Roman state bureaucracies and administrations. And so, so in many of the German-speaking lands and in northern Italy and in Gaul, many of these subsequent kingdoms then welcomed with open arms these learned scholars of Irish descent. And of course, the most famous was that of Charlemagne, the king of the Franks, who in the year 780 met the monk who actually wasn't Irish, but came out of this same Floruit, this same monastic movement, and that was Alcuin, the former master of the Cathedral of York in northern Britain. So as I mentioned a moment ago, before the arrival of these monks, literacy on the continent was not great. In fact, many of the clerics, many of the bishops, and many of the rulers of these disparate kingdoms, many of them were quite illiterate. Charlemagne himself had made it a point to learn vernacular languages and Latin, but it was left to these famous monks, many of Irish lineage, who through their establishment of these great monastic and educational centers were so influential in educating many of the religious community of Europe and many of the great kings and potentates of Europe. And at the court of Charlemagne, we find what was called a Carolingian Renaissance taking place. So Charlemagne was a great patron of the arts and learning, and he welcomed Alcuin, who he appointed the master of the palace school at his court at Aachen. And this august position was awarded to Alcuin in 1782, and Alcuin would remain the dean or master of the Palatine School at Aachen until 796. And here at the Palatine School, many of the high court officials, the children of the nobility, were educated and trained. And Alcuin also established one of the greatest libraries in all of Europe, with manuscripts that were purchased from the great city of Ravenna, the last sort of Byzantine stronghold on continental Europe, famed for its magnificent mosaic iconography. Manuscripts were also purchased from the famous monastery at Monte Cassino, and also from Rome. So Charlemagne inaugurated this great intellectual ferment that brought to his court scholars not only of Irish descent, but also from as far as Spain, also scholars from the Byzantine court, and Charlemagne had strong ties with the court at Constantinople. So again, this is the great contribution of the Irish monks in preserving the written word and keeping alive the language of the ancients by the copying and transmission of ancient texts in the various scriptoria that were built within these monastic communities. Now, of course, many would, like Thomas Cahill in his famous work, which he published about 25 years ago, How the Irish Saved Civilization. There is an exaggeration there because he forgets to mention the importance of transcription on the part of Islamic scholars in Andalusia or in Baghdad, also pioneering work by Italian scholars in Venice, and transcriptions on the part of Byzantine scholars. But there is no doubt that these Irish monks played a seminal role in the preservation of the written word through their great monastic movement. It's hard to discount how different the world would have been were it not for the work, the pioneering work of these great Irish monks. And more than ever, I think we have to appreciate the importance of the preservation of the written word, perhaps now more than ever before. So next week, we're gonna now look at the work and the importance of the what the Irish monks did in preserving the art of winemaking and the preservation of agriculture, etc. So it was not only in the area of education and scholarship and the preservation of ancient manuscripts, but the monks would play a leading role in resurrecting the ancient art of winemaking and agriculture. So the last two lectures will be devoted to that, and I look forward to seeing you again next week on January the 22nd. So stay well, and I'll see you again next week.